Hello, everyone, and welcome to Your Brain at Work Live. I'm your host, head of events at Erin Wickham, head of events at the Neuroleadership Institute. Thank you for joining us for today's session, Anti-Racism or Anti-Bias. We have a couple of audiences to address today, so welcome to those of you who are joining us on the Zoom platform, and welcome to our friends over on LinkedIn Live and on YouTube, where this session is being simulcast. Thank you all for joining us today. For those of you new to Your Brain at Work, it is the name of one of our best-selling books by our CEO and co-founder, Dr. David Rock. Your Brain at Work is also the name of our blog and podcast. These Friday sessions will be edited and published as a podcast episode, which will be available to you mid-next week. This will be episode 5 of season 3. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. In the Zoom chat, we will have a dedicated team responding to any real questions or providing links and resources as they pop up in today's conversation. And while you are in the chat, if you want to share where you're calling in from, the city, state, country, it helps us build a sense of community for today's conversation. Both Zoom and LinkedIn Live will have a comment section. In Zoom specifically, if you would like your comments to be visible to everyone, please select all panelists and attendees before you post. And as a proactive answer to a very common question, yes, this session is being recorded and you will receive a copy of the recording sent by end of business today. Look for an email from Alexis Burnham. The email will also include a number of resources likely to come up during today's conversation. So if you miss a few links that are shared in the chat, don't worry, it'll all be sent to you later today. A couple of notes on some brain-based learning advice. We suggest that you turn off any inessential programs on your computer. This allows you to get the most out of today's discussion and helps your quality of audio and video broadcast. We do suggest grabbing a pen and paper to jot down any of those insights that might be coming up, as memory and recall are improved by the physical act of writing things down. So, settle in with us for the next hour as our panel differentiates racism and bias and unpacks which issue we believe you should be addressing within your organization. To announce today's speakers, I would like to introduce our Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, who has been tirelessly listening to and partnering with countless companies to evolve their strategies into more modern, progressive cultures. Ester Neznanova, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Erin. Excited to join you.
Our second speaker is a consultant with over 6 years of experience at NLI, helping organizations improve their culture and leadership practices. Camille Inge, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Erin. Hi, everyone.
And today's session will be facilitated by a thought leader who has published a number of very popular articles on allyship, bias, and racism, and is our Vice President of Research, Practices, and Consulting. Khalil Smith, hello.
Hello, how are you?
Good. All right. Are you ready to get started, Khalil?
I am ready to get started. Thank you so much.
Perfect.
Well, everyone, it is wonderful to be with you, and Esther and Camille. I'm excited for this conversation and excited for us to be able to dig in and continue to really unpack quite a bit. For those of you that may not know Neuroleadership Institute, I think that is probably a small percentage of the folks that are listening right now, given that we have so many return visitors and so many folks that listen to our podcast week over week, and we appreciate the dedication and the constant participation. We're a cognitive science consultancy, and we've been around since 1998. Our goal, very simply, is making organizations more human through science. And we do that as a research-driven leadership institute. We've got lots of intellectual property, and we operate in a lot of different countries. And we're very, very fortunate to work with over 50% of the Fortune 100, and lots of smaller companies and up-and-coming companies and startups and all sorts of other folks that are trying to get a handle on any number of things that are happening in your businesses and with your employees and with your strategy and your clients and your customers and everything you can possibly imagine. So what we're going to talk about today is something that our CEO and co-founder, Dr. David Rock, and I wrote about just a little while ago. And it is this idea of really kind of marrying or understanding or differentiating or weighing kind of the idea of anti-racism, which we know has been been very much in the popular press. And it's an amazing best-selling book that is really anchored on this idea and what we would almost kind of call potentially anti-bias or bias mitigation. And where do each of those play? Where are they really beneficial in an organization? Understanding that we all have limited resources, whether financial resources, cognitive resources, time, anything else that we can possibly imagine. Where do we feel like you may get the biggest return on your on those said resources, right? And so part of what we want to do during our time together today is just to pull that apart and to better understand it. And so, you know, we're going to talk about that. I'm fortunate enough to have both Ester and Camille here with me as they both work tirelessly with clients and write about this. And we have an incredible team of researchers at Neuroleadership Institute that are constantly digging through the research and understanding what's coming out and really keeping us honest around what is out there and what should we be doing and how do we stay really true to this. We're going to try as much as possible to avoid overgeneralizing because there's a lot of research and it is kind of, you know, pointed in a lot of different directions. We could spend days or weeks or months pulling apart just these ideas, and there are incredible authors that have done and incredible PhDs and researchers that have done just tremendous amounts of work to really dig into this. But what we want to do is equip you, right? That's what we always do at the Neuroleadership Institute, is to kind of marry the research with the practical application. And so Camille, maybe first and foremost, I'd love for you to maybe just talk to us a little bit about what can we anchor on for this particular conversation as it relates to some of the difference between bias and racism. So I'll go to the next slide when you tell me, but maybe give us something to kind of sink our teeth into there.
Sure, Khalil. So for the purpose of this discussion, thank you for setting it up that way. We could go back and forth, and we have debated back and forth for months. But in its simplest essence, bias tends to be rather unintentional, where racism tends to be more intentional. And I'll go into a bit more detail. So bias is the default, automatic, unconscious process of pattern detection, of sense making, of decision making. And its goal is just to conserve cognitive energy and take shortcuts as much as possible so you can sustain yourself throughout the day. There are over 150 distinct biases, and if you don't mitigate them, they will most likely affect any and every decision that you make, for better or for worse. When it comes to racism, as you said, there's a vast array of scholars who have devoted their lives to this, and everyone can have their own definition of it, the way that they've experienced it. But there's no universal definition. And linguistically, it's very tricky because it's incredibly vague, right? So race is just a construct used to categorize people of similar ethnicities. Originally, it was much more sinister. It was for a hierarchy of intelligence. But it's just a construct of categorization, and then the suffix ism just means it has to do with that thing. So it doesn't give us much to work with, but here's where we can anchor. Generally, racism tends to have this level of intentionality and actively held belief that we can judge people differently based on their race, whereas bias is this unintentional behind the scenes mechanism of preference. Though we do acknowledge there is a gray area in between, for sure.
There's a lot of gray. And to your point, Camille, we have absolutely debated this internally as well. And I don't know that we will land on a definition, but I think for the conversation that we want to have, I love what you just pulled apart there, and to help us understand, you know, the kind of intentionality potentially around racism in this conversation, and then the unintentional consequences of bias. And, you know, we have done lots and lots of research around bias, and there are different types of bias. And so we've really anchored in that space. So when we talk about being a research-guided organization, we've done lots and lots of research around bias and are continuing to do more of that research around race and racism. I think one thing that could potentially be helpful, because Esther, I would love to hear from you in a moment around what you're seeing in organizations and where organizations are dedicating their time and effort and energy and resources. But before we do that, I'd love to hear from all of our participants. And I also love, you know, seeing folks in the chat and adding comments and contributing insights and going back and forth with one another in really positive and productive ways. And similarly, you'll also find that a number of our incredible folks behind the scenes will constantly drop you links to things that we've done or webinars or articles and things like that. So please keep an eye on the chat as well. But the first kind of poll that we'd love to put out to you all is, what has your company done around racism or bias in the past 6 months? And the kind of options being, we've focused on becoming anti-racist, we've focused on mitigating bias, we've focused on both becoming anti-racist and mitigating bias. We've done neither, so we haven't focused on becoming anti-racist or mitigating bias, or we really don't know. And I'm gonna stop sharing just for a moment so that we can both see those results come through, but also use that as a bit of a jumping off point. So we'll leave this up for about another 30 seconds so everybody can get their comments in. And then Esther, would love for you to both react to what you're seeing in the poll, but also tell us how that kind of connects to a lot of the conversations you've been having, because I know you spend vast majorities of your day and week talking to chief diversity officers and CEOs, and those phone calls have only gotten much more prominent over the past few months as leaders have really tried to figure out what they should be focused on and what others are focused on as well. So let's go ahead and close that poll. And I know some folks are either on telephone or joining us through other platforms and may not be able to see the poll. So just want to call out that we've focused on becoming anti-racist is 16% of the responses. We've focused on mitigating bias is 23% of the responses. The largest share is we focused on both becoming anti-racist and mitigating bias, which is 36% of the responses. We've neither focused on becoming anti-racist nor mitigating bias is 17% of responses, and don't know is 8% of responses. So Esther, give us some reflections. How does that marry to what you're seeing and hearing?
Yeah, so the only shocking part of this for me is 17% that neither focus on becoming anti-racist or mitigating bias. And I will say that overall, there has been a big movement from organizations towards doing either one or another, because it is very obvious right now for leaders that not saying anything means being complacent, right? And so that is actually surprising to me, because as you know, a lot of CEOs and leaders have reached out to us and saying, okay, we have to take a stand. How do we actually do that properly? When it comes to what other organizations are doing, some of them, like in this poll, are actually focusing on becoming proactively anti-racist, whether it is updating their policies and really looking at what anti-racist programs might look like, or educating the employees, educating the leaders around race, or giving some training around experimental areas of understanding what racism is and how you actually experience being discriminated against based on your race. I will say that this, a month ago, this was very, very active. And now, thanks also to your subject matter expertise and a lot of other amazing voices, organizations are starting to move from reacting initially to actually acting and thinking about what can we do long term. And that's where we're moving into talking about unconscious bias, because we'll talk about it in a minute. Acts of active racism within organizations are rather rare. Another big area of opportunity that I'm seeing is around the social justice movement. So chief diversity officers are actually being asked to take on another role, which is literally leading social justice movements. And a lot of them are now starting to think about, okay, what does that look like for my organization? And whether it is around community support and reaching out to the communities where we're serving more, which for overall diversity, equity, and inclusion programs is actually really beneficial, because we're moving away from diversity, equity, and inclusion being compliance to it being a strategic imperative, and actually thinking about, okay, actually we need to look at supplier diversity in terms of what businesses we're supporting and which of those come from underrepresented communities. We need to look at how we're serving our communities and what are some of the actions that we're taking to proactively help shift overall perceptions, education gaps, and all of the other essential elements.
Yeah, Love that. And Camille, I would love to come to you, and I'm gonna bring the slides back up because I know one of the things you wanted to talk about is kind of this next element. So you did a beautiful job of articulating how, you know, kind of bias and racism in our construct can be separated out, one around kind of intentionality and potentially the other at times being a bit more unintentional or unconscious. There was something else that you spoke about, and so I'm gonna pull this back up on the slide for folks to see that bias might be less visible in many instances, whereas racism might be more apparent. Would love for you to speak to that and maybe walk us through an example of what you mean.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the work in anti-racism, so Dr. Kendi's book, bestseller, many of you may have read it on the line, it points us to the importance of inspecting systems for evidence of racism, because the systems are what perpetuate our habits, which reinforce our beliefs, et cetera, which we'll talk about more soon. And so if you actually try to do this, you might find it's rather hard. Racism, I can't imagine personally how you would see racism in a modern corporate process, such as talent acquisition. It would wind up being rather apparent and shocking and probably not last there for that long. Bias lives in anything that a human creates. Even algorithms in a computer can be biased. And they're definitely harder to see, but they are swaying the outcomes of our decisions at times drastically in terms of how diverse your organization winds up being, how inclusive it winds up being, et cetera. But thankfully, we have found a way to make bias more visible, which some of you may be familiar with. Our research team a couple years ago went through all of those 150 unconscious biases and categorized them into 5 categories that have very similar mechanisms. And they all look very different. So they're less visible until you have that lens, that decoder, if you will. And that's the SEEDS model of bias. And you can actually use that to comb through a system and find evidence of bias where you might not be able to actually see if there's any racism in your system. You can do it with bias with this model. And I can show you an example as you set me up for. Okay, you do not have to read all the text on this, but this is an excerpt from a real talent acquisition process in the job opening and sourcing phase. And you might read this, and if I were to ask you, find racism in this system. Candidates can be added by employees using refer a friend to a job feature. Okay. The recruiter can send them an invitation to apply, reference check, optional. I don't see it. But what we can do is use this model, the SEEDS model, which can lead us to pick people who are more similar to us. Similarity bias over those who are different. Expedience bias, going with our gut instead of being more intentional and deliberate in our decisions. Experience bias, just maintaining the status quo. Distance bias, the people who are closer to us rather than those who are farther away. And safety bias, these instincts to protect ourselves from potential threats. Someone who might not be a culture fit might create some noise in the organization. Those things, if we learn those well, we can actually go back to the system, to the process, and spot. Well, when we say candidates can be added by employees using refer a friend to a job feature, that starts to illuminate similarity bias. Refer a friend, that triggers you to think of who's in my in-group rather than who might be the best fit for the job. And et cetera. We could go into detail, but anything that has a start date and end date, a very specific time constraint, that can trigger an expedience bias where you go with your gut, as said before, as opposed to taking the time to consider all of the possible options. And so these are the kinds of things that have a big impact that you can comb your system through to mitigate in the system such that it then affects your habits and then affects your beliefs and then affects your community around you.
Awesome, thank you. And I saw a comment in the chat, Camille, someone was asking about the name of the book that you mentioned by Professor Ibram X. Kendi. So a little bit of a plug, many of us have read it, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Professor Ibram X. Kendi. It is right up there on the bestseller list and has been for quite some time. A really, I think, deliberate and intentional kind of exposition of his own experience and also the experience of race and racism, and just really, really smart in a lot of ways. So definitely worth reading. And similarly, I think, Camille, to your point, part of what we've seen is that opaqueness of trying to identify, well, why was this decision made? Why does this leader have certain, demographics on their team, but this other one doesn't? And where we can look for bias, where we can eliminate that from processes, where we can use shared language, there's a lot of power in being able to do that. And so instead of trying to get into people's intentions or understand, we can look at more of the outputs. And so that work you were just looking at or referencing, that coherence analysis, we've done that with a number of organizations that have said, we're just trying to figure out why we're not getting the outputs that we want. And there can be any number of reasons why, right? Any number of variables. And what we found is that being able to isolate or identify some of those biases and then correct for those things really deliberately, really intentionally, really consistently can and does produce better outcomes. And so, Esther, in a moment, I would love for you to talk about kind of the system piece of some of this. But any reflections based on what Camille was just talking about or what you've been experiencing in this space of really looking for bias?
Yes, what resonates for me, Khalil, is you and I have had a lot of conversations around some of the findings from us holding the listening sessions and the focus groups with Black, Indigenous, and/or people of color over the last 2 months. And it has been obvious as for a while, but it is becoming obvious for organizations that the main challenge is not necessarily, again, going back to it, around racist remarks within the organizations. The main challenge is that people of color don't get hired at the same pace. They don't get promoted at the same pace, and they don't feel like they have equal opportunities or actually feel included within the organization. So that goes back to, if we start looking at all of the processes, I think a big revelation for a lot of companies nowadays is that actually, when you walk into an office or into a virtual office nowadays, you don't leave your prejudices aside. They're actually part of the organizational climate. So we need to make sure that from the systemic standpoint, we optimize the systems to mitigate unconscious bias, and through that, increase equity much more within the organizations.
Well, I think that's a natural segue into one of the things that we've also been spending a lot of time talking about, thinking about, because in essence, a lot of what we're talking about is culture change, right? It's identifying there's a thing that is happening in our organization that we're not happy with. And we want to change that thing. We want to figure out how do we do it more effectively or more differently. And I think there's also something to be said for, like, what can we control, right? Potentially within our own four walls. And so to your point, lots more organizations are saying we're actually going to work outside of our four walls as well. And that is absolutely incredible. And you've been a huge advocate and support for a lot of folks that have said, how do I do that? Where do we lean in? How do we get work done? And yet there are also the things that even smaller organizations are saying, we don't have $100 million to donate to this, or we don't have the resources to be able to do this other thing. What we're trying to do is really optimize the experience within our organization and to solve for some of those things that you're describing that come up in listening sessions or come up in other things. And so would love for you to talk people through, and I think many people will be a bit familiar with the way that we talk about priorities, habits, and systems and culture change in that way. But I think this conversation doubles down on the idea that that's really relevant and really valid and really important as we're thinking about bias mitigation as a whole and how that has an impact in addition to or in contrast to becoming more of an anti-racist organization. So maybe if you can talk us through priorities, habits, and systems, because I think that it marries to what Camille was just talking about in terms of looking at the processes, looking at the systems. So what are these three elements?
Definitely. So when we talk about culture transformation, we need to focus both on priorities, habits, and systems equally. The priorities part is really the goals and challenges that the organizations has and wants to achieve. But in order for us to follow through on those goals or on those priorities, we need to make sure that we instill the right types of habits within the organization and then support those through the systems. So let me just explain what each element means as we talk about unconscious bias. From the priorities standpoint, the first part is being able to establish the right goals to drive the change. But it is also getting the leadership buy-in. So once you decide where your organization stands, it is important to get all leaders on board and get their buy-in. And it is also important for them to own their own narrative within it. So to educate the leaders around how to really be achieving those goals. The second important element when it comes to priorities is understanding how do the employees actually hear what you're saying. How do we make sure that it doesn't get lost in translation once we share it with all of the employees? From the habits standpoint, it is moving away from education that is just around awareness and making sure that the training that you're giving is actually focused on giving tangible habit formation skills in order to be able to activate better behaviors, right? Because it is, when it comes to mitigating unconscious bias, it is really making better decisions daily where the change really happens. It's not necessarily about creating awareness around bias. Awareness is good and it's not enough, and we've written a lot about it. The last part here that is also essential is the systems. And the systems is pretty much the canvas and the ecosystem of your organization. That includes your talent management systems, that includes your business systems, that includes all of your diversity, equity, and inclusion systems, or how you communicate to each other. And so within it, if we don't look at how the systems are reinforcing or going against the habits and the priorities, the habits just won't stick. So within it, every leader can take responsibility in looking at the systems that are within their control. If you're building products, start looking at where exactly unconscious bias shows up, where you build products for yourselves and your team much more than for all of the customers and communities. And I know that a lot of technology companies are really looking at exploring that area. If you're in supply chain, again, how do you make decisions around diverse suppliers? How are you supporting communities? These are your business systems. And of course, overall talent management systems within your organization and in your line of business. You need to start really questioning and wondering, where might unconscious bias show up in order to drive for systemic transformations?
Love that. Thank you, Esther. And would love to either, maybe come to you and or Camille. There was a question that came up in the chat. Are you aware of any equity assessments that can be used in large orgs? So the first one that jumps out to me is the Neuro Leadership Institute does have an organizational climate survey, organizational climate assessment that we use, either SEEDS or SCARF. Would love if maybe one of you could speak a little bit to what that is meant to accomplish, or how we've used organizational climate surveys to better understand the experience that people are having in an organization.
So I would love for Camille to talk about organizational climate surveys, but before we go there, I just want to talk about equity in general, right? And I talk to CEOs and CDOs all the time and give briefings to them around inclusion. And I think that one of their biggest aha moments and insights is understanding that inclusion is not just culture, right? So we say inclusion, belonging, power dynamics, equity, where in reality, what we talk about in Neuro Leadership Institute is that equity or fairness, power dynamics or status, right? As well as making sure that you belong within the organization is actually all part of inclusion. That's why we use inclusion framework called SCARF, that stands for status, which is really power, certainty and autonomy as ways for you to be able to be in control around your outcomes. And then relatedness, which is really that sense of belonging, and fairness, which is really equity. So I think that we need to start rethinking how we approach inclusion in general, because equity is actually an essential part of feeling included, and there's going to be no inclusion without equity. But Camille, on to you regarding
that scarf connection is, I think, a very powerful tie-in to some of the organizational climate surveys.
Yeah, I admire our measurement team. They put together some really great work. They're researchers and analysts, and they've put together an organizational climate survey that will survey your employees in, I think, 3 different domains. One is psychological safety. So hearing right from them, what is the sense that they feel safe enough to take risks, make mistakes, that they feel like they belong, that they're included. That does follow the SCARF model. It's a validated assessment. There's also one on growth mindset and one on bias, I believe. Someone will keep me honest in there. But it's a great way to hear right from your employees what they perceive to be the level of psychological safety, which would include instances of fairness in there. And then use that to inform, of course, a strategy for how to resolve that.
Thank you. I just saw that in the chat and wanted to address it. I know there are a couple other great comments coming up in the chat that we will make sure that we get an opportunity to get to. And Esther and Camille, please keep me honest because I know you're looking through the chat as well. Camille, I would love to come back. And I think one of the places where we've had a lot of debate, a lot of really incredible partnership from our research team. I mean, honestly, I continue to get educated every single time I have conversations about this. And I talk about it a lot. And so I'm constantly feeling like, okay, here's something I didn't know. Here's a term I didn't know. Here's a thing that is really kind of being pulled together. Is this balance between one of the other things that we call out, and I'll pull this slide back up, this idea that racism isn't biological, but a lot of bias is. And again, you know, we take kind of these sharp contrasts in terms of saying one thing is or isn't. We know there's a lot of research in multiple dimensions, and yet for the simplicity of being able to do something in an organization, to really take something, boil it down to its real essence and its constituent parts, and then say, so here's what we're going to do with that. Part of what I believe that I've seen through the research and through the language is that, you know, race, and you spoke about this before a little bit, Camille, is largely a sociological construct. And I'd love for you to kind of talk a little bit about that. And then if it is sociological, why it's not biological, and why maybe bias is a bit more biological, or a lot of the bias that we tend to think of or talk about is a bit more biological, and why that distinction is useful. So I just asked you like 17 questions, all in the same question, but take that and run with it as you see fit.
Yeah, racism is not biological. It is a learned belief, learned behaviors that follow it. Race itself is not biological. That is a construct, as we said, that was invented usually with malintent. And so it having biological grounding, that is not true, but the idea that it did justified a lot of really bad behaviors. Like, it's okay that I treat these people as if they're subhuman because biologically they are. It's been proven. The way that we, you know, swat a fly without batting an eye, we think it's okay. You know, they're beneath us. That's learned. That is false. It's incredibly dangerous. And so understanding that it's something that's learned, I think, gives me a little bit more hope that it's something that can be unlearned, or it's something that we can ensure that we teach the next generation very intentionally. Otherwise. But bias being biological, it does set up a little bit more of a roadblock there. But there are ways that we can surpass just its survival benefits. Like, it does help us in moments of like fight or flight to make immediate decisions that could save our life. But of course, it can also lead us to make decisions that damage somebody else's life in that moment. So it is really important to understand why bias exists, how it works automatically in the brain, and what sorts of preventative measures you can put in place to steer your brain onto a different set of tracks. Whether it's through if-then plans, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point, actual preventative measures, like in your Odysseus article, putting beeswax in your ears so you're not lured away by the sirens and crash your ship. But we can really deeply understand it because it is a biological concept, which means we can make it a little bit more tangible and adapt accordingly.
Love that. And I see in the chat a couple folks have asked us to kind of go back to that seed slide. So I'm going to bring that back up partially just because I think what you're describing, Camille, and again, one of the things that has been kind of pulled apart and we've talked about it is that there are absolutely parts of bias, parts of the way that we see our world, which are also sociological, right? They're the magazines that we read and the movies that we watch and just the culture that surrounds us. And yet what seeds is really meant to capture are those cognitive biases, those evolutionary biases that you're talking about that don't excuse the behavior, but do help to explain the behavior. And so what both of you are describing in terms of, well, we can focus on the systems to help kind of extricate or mitigate some of that bias. We can focus on our habits, we can raise awareness, we can do all of these things, but ultimately, in order to be able to do something about it, we talk quite often about this idea that we need to accept that brains are biased, we need to label that bias using shared language, and then we need to mitigate that bias using really clear and research-backed plans and processes. And so when we look at each of these biases and recognize, as Camille, you walked us through the kind of talent acquisition process to say, well, wait a second, when we're doing this, we may be creating this type of suboptimal outcome. And so how do we look at our outcomes? How do we look at our inputs? How do we evaluate all of that through the lens of bias and recognize that these biases are influencing, as you said, Camille, every human process that is out there. And the more that we can recognize, and Esther, you said this previously, that part of what people are asking for, what we hear people asking for so often is not, and I love the fact that most of what we deal with in the professional world is not what we would refer to as outright racism, right? But when we talk to people that say, you know, hey, you know, I changed my name on my resume and all of a sudden I started getting more responses back, or I have a work name and my actual name, right? Because I recognize that my actual name may lead me to not get a call back on a particular resume, or I have to be cautious about the way that I speak because I know that I fit a certain demographic and people view me in a particular way, or I'm never kind of lifted up for these opportunities, and I know for a fact that my performance is at the same level as some of my peers. And to your point, Camille, it's hard to see, and there may absolutely be some really malicious intent behind those things, but in the vast majority of instances, what we're seeing is that it's bias, right? It is people not knowing that they're making bad decisions or not recognizing that the outcomes are not where they should be. And I think we need to continue to investigate it and pull those things apart and recognize which of these are happening, but recognizing that we have a limited amount of resources. Is there one of these things that is contributing to more than the other? And so ideally, the kind of giveaway is let's solve for both, right? Like let's eliminate both of those things. Let's mitigate both of them. But where can we focus some of our time and our energy and our attention? Esther,
I wanted to bring in so many thoughts, but I wanted to bring in now 3 questions that are very similar. So Nazir said to talk about a little bit about the global audience, right? Because, and a few other people also mentioned expanding a little bit beyond the United States and also expanding a little bit beyond what's currently happening in the United States when it comes to the social justice movement. And that I think is also a point around when you're talking about unconscious bias, especially when you're talking about similarity bias, the mitigation strategies for it is actually finding commonalities. And then in global organizations, solving for unconscious bias is actually solving for a lot of different racial challenges that exist within different countries. So we're not talking here about the US specifically when it comes to anti-racist or when it comes to anti-bias. And when you're focusing on building the strategies, and we have a lot of global organizations around mitigating conscious bias, is actually creating the proper foundation in order to really remove systemic bias, no matter what country and what race we're talking about. That being said, we actually need to pay attention to what's happening in the United States and how important it is to talk about the experience of people of color in this country. So curious what comes up for you, Khalil, here when it comes to the global challenges versus the US and really the focus needed there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. And I think to your point, you know, I've had amazing opportunities to work with global companies that have done work in a lot of different spaces. And part of what I've always loved about the neuroscience is that in a lot of ways it operates across cultures. And so the things that we're talking about, whether those are organizational climate surveys or SCARF or SEEDS, they're not specific to particular demographics, particular generations, particular kind of groups of people. There are absolutely differences across cultures. There are differences across groups of people. There are differences across organizations. And yet there are lots of similarities in things that we can identify and see similar trends and themes across a lot of what we're describing. And we also see the conversations that are happening right now around race or around bias or around prejudice or around stereotyping are not isolated to the United States, right? We're having conversations around Indigenous peoples in Australia and Canada. We're having conversations around former slave owners in the UK and the Netherlands. We're having conversations around, femicide in Mexico. Like there are lots of different challenges that countries and organizations and global organizations that work across countries are having. And what we're all trying to figure out is, so what do we do about that, right? How do we help to solve for some of that? And that's part of what this conversation is about, is recognizing that there are very particular things that we can do. I've heard people say before, there's no silver bullet, but there is silver buckshot, right? There are a collection of things that we can do to say, well, if we do this and this and this and that, and if we learn from these things, and if we, bring in the science and understand the way that we tend to react and understand what others have gone through, and in some instances, if we reject what has traditionally been conventional wisdom, because conventional wisdom has not always worked, right? If it did, we probably wouldn't still be having some of the same challenges that we've had for 30 or 40 or 50 years or 400 years or however much longer you want to go from there. And so knowing that, I personally take a lot of comfort in being able to have really great conversations with our scientists that say, listen, I don't have all the answers, but this is giving us a guiding orientation. It's pointing us in a particular direction, and we can try and iterate and experiment and evolve. And that can and should be done across cultures, across countries, and across populations and demographics.
I love that.
Camille, what would you add, if anything?
Yeah, I would echo that, regardless of the identity that we're talking about, whether it's race, whether it's sex, whether it's sexual orientation, et cetera, the core of it is that in any society, you'll find power differentials. So some group or set of groups will have an asymmetric control over resources. And it's the systems that are put in place that tend to perpetuate that, to make that acceptable and to make it very hard to combat it. And so it just points back to whatever you're trying to solve for in terms of creating more equity, more fairness, more justice. You do have to turn to those systems and inspect them for ways that they are self-perpetuating, that they are keeping people outside, not being able to have a voice, not being able to change the direction of the society or of the organization or the culture. So just to loop it back to that it is very pervasive and broadly applicable.
One other thing that I kind of want to bring up that we've talked about in the article, and we've talked about it a bit, quite a bit internally as well, and I'll share my screen again, is this idea that, and again, I say tends because we can always find instances where this is not the case. Camille, you brought this up earlier, that inside of organizations, it tends to be challenging to find a system that is anchored in racism. Right? There are absolutely individuals, and not always difficult to see from time to time, who may be operating with a particular skewed viewpoint, and yet what you've seen, and Esther would love for you to speak to this as well, that bias tends to influence both individuals and systems. So Camille, you were talking before around algorithms and systems and processes, and Esther, you were talking about kind of this marriage of the priorities, the habits, and the systems. So when we think about bias influencing individuals and systems, talk to us a little bit about, first, Esther, maybe come to you. What does this mean to you when we say something like racism tends to influence individuals, bias tends to influence individuals and systems?
We had an amazing conversation was it last week at your Brain at Work, when we talked about the leaders buy-in and the challenges with just focusing on the culture, right? But just point blank, if you have a lot of bias within your systems and your processes, then you're not going to be able to build products, to launch services, or to be successful long term. And we have so many examples of this, starting with technology companies, will not name them, launching computer vision technologies that they worked on for over 10 years and then realizing that they can't recognize people of color, whether it is a lot of issues from the fashion houses that lead them to the front page of New York Times. And these are massive examples, but really when we start looking at the systems, and it includes business systems within the organizations, you cannot build products or services if you don't have diverse teams and if you're not representing your customers. And you know, my previous job was in corporate innovation, and I got so tired of walking into rooms and having yet another set of 4 white male explain to me how women shop. You can't do that. And that is such a simple example that we all need to realize that it really infiltrates a lot of systems. And then another big challenge is that we talk about a lot is non-diverse teams feel much more comfortable. Mm-hmm. So you have a very low attrition rate. Let's say I hire a bunch of my friends. I love spending time with my friends. I can talk to them for ages and we come up with great ideas and we all have same backgrounds and we launch those products. That's all fine and nice. Yet when it comes to productivity, when it comes to innovation, and when it comes to fairness, really, we need to invest in diverse teams. And it's harder to be productive within the diverse teams initially, because it's much harder to generate common ideas. But they're so much better that there is a very, very direct and objective impact on the business when you're increasing diversity. So I just wanted to ground us on that first, because we've been talking a lot about culture, and I think that organizations really need to realize why diversity is important to them. Yeah. And then I'll pass it on to Camille.
And Camille's coming off mute.
I don't have anything to add at this point. I'm actually just enjoying listening to you. Thank you.
Right, I'm seeing that in the chat as well. Lots of people are enjoying listening to the two of you, which is amazing. And I think, you know, one of the things that is useful is to continue to anchor back on, you know, there are absolutely kind of the things that happen in a society that we should all be paying attention to. And we have had those conversations and talked about it. And then there are things that happen in an organization. Right. And there are times where those things are going to wind up being different. And so when we look at racist systems, you can absolutely find racism all across the world, right? Systems that were really, really anchored in this idea that one group is better than or less than another. It is very challenging to find any publicly traded company where you could find a system that you could look at and say, that is a clear, at least as far as I've seen. And again, I'm always learning, happy for people to kind of, you know, raise something and say, hey, Khalil, you haven't seen this thing. But from my view, what I've seen with so many organizations is people saying, I don't know why we keep losing X demographic of people. And then you look at their process and you see, well, because we've defined success as this, and that whole group of people don't match what you've identified. And then they say, oh my gosh, we never thought of it that way, or we never considered that. Or Camille, to your point, you know, recruit a friend. It's like, well, as Esther, as you were saying, a lot of my friends think very similar to me, right? They had similar backgrounds to me. I met them when we were relatively young. And so while that may absolutely be done with the best of intentions, it is creating suboptimal outcomes. And the more that we can kind of go back to the intent, go back to the output, look at those systems and really run them through with a different lens, the better off we are. And so I think we have to be able to separate out the kind of environmental, sociological, kind of, you know, what happens at government or any government across the world, and what's happening in for-profit companies or even nonprofit companies, and how do we solve for some of that? We will continue to, at Neuro Leadership Institute, look to solve for both of those things. And yet the vast majority of people that are coming to us and asking for input are not running whole countries. They're running departments, they're running teams, they're running companies where they're saying, we want to do better and we just haven't yet been able to figure out how. And part of what we're putting forward is this is a bit of that how.
And I think to that point, Khalil, especially when in bigger organizations, what we also see a lot in looking at their systems and looking at their employee data is that they're actually not quite thinking about all of those systems cohesively as an actual employee experience. Yeah. So then the leaders keep receiving that data saying, oh, this is the attrition and it's slow, and here are the promotion rates for people of color, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't look at it in terms of an overall employee experience. And when we start looking at, okay, for instance, Black women get promoted at X rate overall in the company, but when it comes to a director level, they stay in a position for 7 years, whereas white people stay in the position for a year and a half, right? And once we start looking at it in terms of individual and their individual experiences, there is a very, very different picture that we're seeing. And so when we look at it from kind of like a bird's eye view in talking to those organizations, we need to shift how we see all of these processes. And we also need to start owning the experience of employees within our teams.
Yeah. And Esther, part of what I hear you saying is this idea that there are these thousands or tens of thousands or millions of instances that are happening that are the bias, Camille, that you were talking about before and that you both walked us through. And one of the analogies that I've used from time to time is this idea, and I'll pull it up on the slide, that there are some things that are very salient, that are very memorable, that are very in your face, and that there's an example to be made between kind of shark attacks and mosquito, or shark deaths and mosquito deaths, right? Shark deaths are about 10 people a year. And of course we want to solve for those. Of course those lives are important. And yet if we focus more on that and miss the hundreds of thousands of lives that are lost to mosquitoes, we unintentionally put more effort in a place that is very visible, that is very interesting, that is very salient, that is very kind of memorable, as opposed to the thing that may be happening behind the scenes that we just kind of have started to accept as a norm. And I would argue that the kind of guidance around focusing on racism, again, let's get rid of it, right? Let's absolutely, and Esther, you and I were talking about this the other day, there have to be policies, there have to be procedures, there has to be clear-cut information that these behaviors are categorically unacceptable in our organization. And yet, if we do that, and don't focus on the bias that is negatively influencing all of those examples that you both have provided around people moving forward, people being promoted, people being recognized, people feeling included, people feeling like outcomes are fair and equitable, then we're missing something in favor of another. And so ideally, let's marry both and solve for both of those things, but it should not be that we are over anchoring on the thing that may be more memorable and missing the thing that is actually having arguably a massive and substantive effect on the vast majority of our employees. So I do want to start to wrap us up because I just looked and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this time has flown in the way that it has. I do want to ask the group another poll and get your results here. So this one is, what do you think presents the biggest opportunity for positive change at your organization? First option being addressing racism is a bigger opportunity than addressing bias. The second, addressing bias is a bigger opportunity than addressing racism. The third, both racism and bias present opportunities of similar size. The fourth being, I believe, neither racism nor bias are significant. And the fifth being, don't know. And we'll give you about another 30 seconds to fill that out. And then similarly, I will read out the results for folks that are not able to see the poll for one reason or another, whether because of the platform they're on or because they're dialing in over the phone. So about 20 more seconds. And we're starting to see all of the results coming in, which is wonderful. And we'll take down the poll in about another 5 seconds. All right. So 1% saying that racism is a bigger opportunity than bias. 61%, which is our largest share, addressing bias is a bigger opportunity than addressing racism. 31% that both present similar or opportunities of similar size. 1% saying I believe neither is significant, and 5% saying I don't know. So thank you so much for that guidance and your poll and your feedback. It's always great for us to be able to hear what's going on and to understand your perspective. And so I just want to kind of wrap us up and say, Esther and Camille, huge thank you to you for your insights, for your work in this space, for your thoughts. I will also give a huge thank you to all of the folks behind the scenes at the Neuroleadership Institute who are off doing briefings and keynotes and helping us to continue to go through all of the data and all of the research, and personally helping to continue to influence my point of view and hopefully make it even tighter and sharper. For anyone, questions that we did not get to, please just let us know if you'd like us to reach out to you. I think we might have one more poll about any ways that you would like for us to reach out to you. There we go. And then just a couple other things that I'm going to speak to in a moment in terms of kind of what comes next for us. So how can we best serve you? For anybody that's not on the line, you won't be able to necessarily see this, but we do demos of kind of understanding our point of view around this. We've done lots of listening sessions, as Esther was saying, so happy to support there. Allyship, we've done a number of amazing kind of sessions and articles on that. We had an incredible webinar, or Your Brain at Work, with Lindsay Ray McIntyre from Microsoft. Coherence analysis, which Camille spoke to in terms of really being able to take a look at a particular process and look at that thing through the lens of bias mitigation and help you identify some places where bias may be unintentionally creeping in. The NLI Summit, I am just about to speak to, so you might want some more information about that as well. We also do lots of individual development. So I know a number of people were asking, are there ways to get kind of certified in seeds? So in some organizations, we do train the trainers. So that is a way, if your organization is rolling out some of our solutions, for you to become way more familiar. We've got an incredible group of master facilitators that make sure that people are very informed about the content. And then nothing for now, thanks. So we'll go ahead and close that one out. Thank you so much for your responses there. And then similarly, I'm just going to kind of walk through a couple things. One, if you work at an organization that we work with, we are not actively recruiting you, I promise, but we are still hiring and actively hiring for lots of incredible opportunities. So please go to neuroleadership.com/careers if you think this is the type of thing you would love to do. And as you can tell, we really enjoy it and have a lot of fun doing it. So would love to work with other smart and capable people. And in terms of our summit, we've got our summit, our annual summit coming up. Obviously this year we will be going virtual. It's our first year doing it all virtual. And we're really focused on 3 days to change the world of work. So in order to do that, we're doing day one is going to be kind of from the lab, which is cutting edge research and breakthrough discoveries. Day two is blending that science and application that we've talked about, solving the most pressing challenges and really getting insights and guidance from you all as participants and attendees. And then day three, from the field, right? Learning what leading companies are doing and really being able to kind of look inside those organizations and get some of that same benefit that Esther talks about that all of us are able to get when we're off talking to some of the world's most premier CDOs, CEOs, chief talent officers, CHROs, and just an incredible C-suite, an incredible kind of manager and director level folks that are doing absolutely wonderful work. And some of the folks that you'll be able to hear from there are some of the folks that you see on this slide right now. So I won't go through all of them, and I would be remiss to even call out one or two, because if you've seen any of them speak, you know they're incredible. They always bring their A game and bring just absolutely wonderful insights. So I am very much looking forward to the summit this year, as I do every year. So with that, I will just say thank you everyone for your time, your participation, your questions. If there's anything we did not get to, we're happy to follow up. So just let us know. Reach out by going to neuroleadership.com, and we would love to stay connected. So thank you so much.
Thanks, team. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.
All right. Well, thank you, Camille, Esther, and Khalil for your conversation today. Thank you for everyone who shared with us in the chat. This formally concludes our presentation for today. And on behalf of the NLI team and our panelists, thank you, and we hope you have a great weekend.